And it looks like we are live. So welcome to Spirit and Counsel. I'm just going to check the Facebook stream. In order for you to show up on Instagram, we're going to have to get a little closer. You're going to have to come my way a little bit. All right, so we're going to go live on Instagram. And we're going to have to check Facebook because we got some fishy stuff going on. But thank you for joining us, everybody. This is our once a month podcast where we kind of bring two worlds together that are actually, I think, very closely related.
Yes.
And that is, ministry and spiritual health, along with counseling and emotional and mental health. So I am Justin, and this is my lovely wife.
I'm LeeAnna. It's great to be here tonight.
Absolutely. We've been married for 20 years. We have 4 kids, and it's a miracle every month that we're able to go live at 8:30 on a weeknight.
Literally
There's
a
no
miracle.
screaming in the background. There's no smoke or anything like that. So this is the grace of God on display right here.
It's true.
Now, I'm checking our Facebook stream. Something that you could do to help us, as always, is consider sharing the video. That really helps it to get in front of more people. It also causes the algorithm to kind of take notice and promote it.
Yeah.
So if you're on Facebook, please share. If you're on YouTube, please subscribe to the channel. Wherever you're watching, please like and comment. Let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to be able to interact with you in the chat a little bit. So hopefully you will do that, share the video. All right, it looks like we are live on 5 different locations. So far, so good. All right, well, we're going to get into a topic tonight that I think is very, very relevant. You know, there's a lot going on in the body of Christ right now.
There's a whole lot, yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of, traumatic, disappointing, painful things that we're observing that I know literally millions of people are connected to in some way.
Yeah.
Because of the very visible ministries that have had major scandals and kind of heartbreaking, falls from grace. I know we've been connected to some of the ministries that have been, experiencing this IHOP, and there's even others sort of around the world right now where it seems like God is exposing things. He's cleaning house. He's really, I think, getting his people in a healthy place. And sometimes that means that he has to do, a deep work. And so we want to talk tonight about something that has to do with the posture of our heart. How do we walk through things in a healthy way? How do we walk through things that potentially could take us out, that could derail us, that could cause us to miss out on our destiny.
Yeah.
But if we posture our heart in the right way, then these things can actually help us to accelerate. They can help us to be strong and really help us to thrive. So do you want to kind of talk about what our topic's going to be? And then, we'll kind of take it from there. I'll lead into that awesome story that we're going to kind of riff off of.
Yeah. Well, I think this past Wednesday in your supernatural theology, you also kind of started this conversation. So we're going to kind of be picking up a little bit from your podcast, from your talk, and kind of weaving in some emotional health. So our topic tonight is overcoming rejection, offense, and bitterness. And we're using the story of Joseph as kind of our, template.
Yeah. Probably not a better example in Scripture of someone who had the opportunity for offense and bitterness and unforgiveness and to be under rejection than him. So that's kind of what we're going to use as a pattern, as a blueprint. And again, for those of you who are joining, I know there's some that have just joined us. Welcome, and we invite you to comment. Let us know where you're watching from so that we see that you're with us. Also consider sharing the video. But we wanted to talk about the life of Joseph. This past week was Resurrection Week, and so on Wednesday we talked about Joseph as kind of a blueprint where he both mirrors the life of Jesus in a lot of ways, but he also mirrors our life in a lot of ways. You know, big or small, every one of us go through some kind of rejection.
Yeah.
We go through some kind of opportunity for offense.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yep. We have opportunities to keep our heart right in the midst of painful things, which is usually one of the greatest challenges we ever go through.
It is.
But it's also, I think, one of the fast tracks to, accelerating into our fullness, our destiny of kind of being prepared to be trustworthy, to carry significant responsibility and spiritual authority. And so why don't we start with, we'll just kind of start with the beginning of Joseph's story, and, feel free at any time, interject, and we'll just kind of go back and forth. So as we know, Joseph's story starts out that his father, whenever he's born, since he was a son of Rachel, he was favored over his other brothers. And so that caused an issue, of course. If parents play favorites, it's obviously going to cause issues. The others are going to be wounded. They're going to be jealous. They're going to resent the one that's the favored one. And so he gives him this coat of many colors, and it's just this big glaring, annoyance in the face of the other brothers saying, I'm the favorite. And then Joseph has these dreams about how one day the sun and the moon and the stars are going to bow down to him. One day his brothers and his mother and father are going to bow down to him. And his brothers get so annoyed with him, they come up with a scheme. First, that they were going to murder him and say that he was killed by animals. But Reuben steps in and he says, let's not let his blood be on our hands. Why don't we'll leave him in this well and he'll die. And then, we won't have blood guilt on our hands. Yeah. Doesn't really work that way. They still would have been guilty. But it actually says that he planned to go back and rescue Joseph. So Reuben was actually trying to save his life. But these slave traders come through. And the brothers get him out of the pit, out of the well, and they actually sell him as a slave into Potiphar's house. So, major trauma in Joseph's life. He's now being rejected and hated by his brothers to the point that they were going to kill him. And now he's being sold and carried off to another nation as a slave. I mean, how terrifying and how horrible would that be? Yeah, so I'm thinking about the story from the lens of like emotionally, right? Like up until up to this point, I'm thinking about, oh my goodness. Well, first of all, I know the Bible talks about not provoking your sons to anger, right? And so I'm just kind of thinking about that verse as we're talking about this story about the father, and and how he treated Joseph compared to his other sons. Yeah, and that kind of getting the ball rolling here, right? Like. And so, and then I'm thinking about Joseph. So obviously the Lord spoke to him in a dream, giving him some prophetic insight on, maybe something that's going to happen in his life. I mean, clearly we know it did, but it's probably very encouraging and exciting to him. He's probably really happy about those dreams.
So I'm wondering, I'm just kind of processing this. I wonder if maybe he should have kept that dream to himself. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Do you ever think about things in the scripture this way? I'm wondering, where, was that maybe the healthiest thing for him to do? Definitely not. His father actually even rebuked him for it. Yeah. And so I think sometimes, in the word that it's kind of shows us, I don't know what to do and to not to do. Yeah. Right. And so I know, even in my own life, perhaps there's been prophetic words or dreams that are so exciting and are so oh my gosh, let me go share this. I can't wait for this to happen. I need to share this with someone. And the Lord, has said, this is just for you and me right now. Right. And so and that takes some, that takes some emotional health, right? Yeah, and I think it takes some maturity. I think the more you mature, I almost never discuss
personal prophetic words anymore.
Yeah, you really
20 years
don't,
ago,
yeah.
I definitely would have.
Yeah.
But I think there's, healthy or not, there's a process that I've gone through anyway where I kind of play my cards a lot closer to the chest when it comes to personal words.
Yeah, right. And so anyways, I just want to kind of acknowledge that piece, right? Mm-hmm. So, and I know that for those that have been listening, I think some of that has to do with, I'm going to always talk about self-awareness, right? So like, how are my actions, how are my emotions, how are what I'm doing impacting myself and those around me, right? Mm-hmm. Positive, negative, in between. So anyways, not, so I'm just throwing that out there. And then I'm thinking about how Joseph, I'm just wondering, I'm practicing empathy here, what that would have been like for him to have been sold by his brothers, the ones that he's grown up with, or his blood, or, that are just, I don't know, I think about my kids, right? Like, oh my word, if one of them sold the other, like, oh,
they would be in so much trouble.
But you're right, like that is the definition of trauma in today's language. But I think one of the things, and we're going to keep processing here, is that Joseph did not allow his life to be defined by the trauma. Mm-hmm. So we're going to talk more about that, but keep going.
And I think that talking about emotional health, and I know we'll probably talk about how from one generation to another, a lot of these things can become patterns, and things that mistakes that one generation makes can be passed on to other generations. With Abraham, it was a little bit different in that he had Isaac and Ishmael, but Ishmael ended up having to be kicked out of the house, right? So there was this major rift between the brothers, and, two different mothers, which thank God that's not the way we operate anymore. How could there ever be a home with peace if you had multiple wives? I mean, it's just not a very healthy setup to begin with. But, the wives hated each other. The brothers were in conflict. So one of the sons actually had to be kicked out of the house with his mother, and God promised to provide for him and make even Ishmael a great nation. And then you go on to Isaac, and you see that Isaac, so obviously Abraham had a favorite son. Understandably, it was Isaac, the son of promise. But then Isaac had sons, and he had a favorite son. There was Jacob and Esau, and he preferred Esau because Esau was a hunter, and he provided, he brought this meat that Isaac loved. And so Jacob grew up with this kind of a complex, he was looking for the favor of his father, and he would lie, cheat, steal, deceive, whatever he could to kind of get the favor of his father. And ultimately God went after his heart, and God kind of healed that wound, and God gave him a blessing like nobody before him. But now in the next generation, we're basically seeing this same sort of a rift between brothers, fathers choosing a favorite son. And so really, even from the root with Abraham, there's a lot of emotionally unhealthy stuff going on there.
There is.
Sort of passed from generation to generation.
Yeah, and I think that even in my practice with my clients, we'll take a look at, what are some of the generational stuff? Mm-hmm. What are some of the things that maybe you're dealing with that, I'm talking to my client that perhaps, has your, the people before you and the people before you have dealt with that, and how do we create change? And so, I think that's mind, body, spirit, and it takes it takes a lot of work to create generational change. Generational work is not easy. I think that, of course, at times there's deliverance included. There's, there's supernatural things, but then also there is the creating new patterns emotionally, mentally, even in relationally, and that's hard work. That's hard work. It's a lot easier to continue doing the things that you've seen be done from generation to generation. And so we'll talk about that, because Joseph, he changed. He did generational work in the end, and he created change in his lineage. So,
yeah, the iniquities of the fathers are passed to the third and fourth generation. The blessing of the Lord passes to 1,000 generations. So I like to look at it like, the blessing which goes to 1,000 generations is 300 times more powerful than the iniquity or the sinful stuff that goes to 3 or 4 generations. But nevertheless, I think you have to pursue generational blessings in order for them to affect your life. Generational iniquity almost automatically affects your life if
it
you don't do
does.
anything about it.
It really does. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so we pick up the story back with Joseph. He's potentially brokenhearted. He's betrayed. He's feeling rejected. You just can't imagine the fear. I mean, we don't know how old he was. We know he was 30 whenever he took his seat at the right hand of Pharaoh. So he was probably 18, 20, somewhere in there, a young adult, a young man. And so now he's been sold as a slave. But the next scene that we see in his life, he's not bitter and angry and defeated and giving up on life. He actually has something going on in his heart that he is so responsible, and he's handling himself with such excellence that Potiphar, who purchases him as a slave, actually makes him like the steward of his household. So he actually, something happens that the story doesn't tell us about that causes him to be promoted to actually a place of responsibility and authority in Potiphar's house. And so I think that's pretty remarkable. We can kind of fill in the blanks on what he didn't do. He obviously didn't choose to despise and to hate Potiphar, and he didn't choose to allow a root of bitterness to defile his whole life so that he's angry and depressed and just a foul person that nobody wants to be around.
Well, and he didn't choose to own rejection as his identity either, right? I mean, I don't know if you've ever met someone who struggles with rejection, who, anything that even small amounts feels or seems rejecting, that just, it really changes the way they do relationship. It changes the way they look at themselves. It changes the way that they do life, in a sense, their self-esteem, their confidence. And so he did not choose the path of rejection at all. I think rejection, we were talking about this before. I think shame is connected to rejection. I think self-hatred. Obviously, if you allow it to stay, then resentment, and then eventually bitterness. And that's dangerous. That's, that affects your personality. That affects what you do and you don't do. That affects what you say. It affects a lot of things. And so clearly Joseph it doesn't seem that he's walking in those things, because I would imagine Potiphar would not have put him in charge of his house, because that would have been an angry household.
Yeah, and so it looks like he does not allow rejection to kind of define him and shape him. It looks like he does actually allow the dreams of greatness to define him. So the word of the Lord over his life that says you're destined for a position of authority, it seems like he was carrying himself in that way, because even though Potiphar's house, Potiphar was an official, an important person, but his house, being in a position of authority in his house, is definitely not the same as the sun and the moon and the stars bowing down to you.
Sure.
But he's like, this is where I'm at, and so I'm going to walk in what the Lord has spoken over my life right where I'm at. It doesn't look anything like what's been promised to me, but I'm going to carry myself with excellence, and I'm going to carry myself, with honor right here where I'm at. And so he was operating like someone who's called to carry authority and responsibility, and he ended up being positioned in responsibility and authority. I also think it's interesting, often our emotional stuff undealt with opens a door for the enemy, right? And so there can be demonic stuff that's attached to our emotional baggage. Yeah. And a lot of the time, this is almost across the board. Like, a spirit of lust on someone can even begin to change the way that they talk, some perverse spirits. There is a real thing. This will sound offensive, I'm sure, but there's a real thing about a spirit of homosexuality that will actually sometimes change the way that men pronounce words. It's a fact. Certain spirits of addiction, you can almost tell by looking at someone when they're on certain drugs. And in the same way, like a spirit of rejection coming on someone, it causes them to behave in a way that makes you want to reject them.
Yeah.
Like there's something about it, like someone who's really got a spirit of rejection, it makes you want to push them away. The way they act, the way they talk, the way they carry themselves. And so I'm sure there's plenty of what I just said that could offend many different sorts of people out there. But what I'm trying to illustrate is the fact that we want to deal with our emotional baggage, because if we don't, we're actually, if we know that there's emotional stuff that's undealt with, that's doing damage in our lives, and we don't deal with it, so we've got truth that we're choosing to reject, we're not operating in truth that we need to deal with our stuff, then it kind of provides a wide open door for the enemy to come in, and he always wants to steal, kill, and destroy. Yeah. And he will, if he has the opportunity. So, but Joseph's woes are not yet over.
They're not.
His opportunities for being promoted are also not yet over. And so
connected.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, all about the heart response. So the next scene that we see is that Potiphar's wife, she's got some immoral stuff. Seems like her own baggage has invited some sort of a demonic presence into her life, because she's going after the young man who is honorably taking care of all of her husband's worries. There's a young man who is like the right hand of her husband, and she says, this is someone I'm going to try to seduce. So she tries to seduce him, and one day she corners him. It actually talks about a process. It wasn't just a one-time thing. She was after him, and one day she kind of corners him, and she says, go to bed with me. He says no. She persists, and so he just takes off running. He's like, I've got to get out of here. Yeah. And she grabs his robe as he's running, but he says, listen, I'd rather go out of here naked, looking guilty, just to keep myself from being defiled by this. So he runs out while she's holding the robe. And of course, she was a scorned lover, and she's going to get back at him for saying no. So she says that Joseph tried to rape her. Yeah. And so obviously Potiphar, being, an important, powerful man, couldn't let that go. So he had Joseph sent to prison. Now, it is interesting that he did not have Joseph executed, which normally that's what a powerful official would do. And so some scholars or commenters will say that it's likely that Potiphar knew the kind of woman that his wife had become. And so he sort of sent Joseph to the dungeon to save face. But if he really thought Joseph tried to rape his wife, he would have had him executed. And so Joseph goes to the dungeon. And what do we see?
So once again, he is faced with overcoming rejection, overcoming, resentment, bitterness, right? Like,
he's had a great
shame.
Injustice done to him. Right. Absolutely shame. Like, now he's accused as a rapist.
And I'm also thinking about how, I wonder if Joseph was thinking back about that dream and thinking, oh my goodness, like, how is this ever going to come to pass? How, Lord, this is not what I expected. This is not how I thought this was going to go, right? So I'm just curious if disappointment was, once again, practicing empathy for Joseph, but I'm sure he had to process some kind of disappointment. He had to maybe even frustration but it sounds like he did, because then what happened?
Yeah, he ends up in the prison, in a dungeon. So imagine, an Egyptian dungeon 4,000 years ago. I mean, you think that going to prison nowadays would be bad. Like, you just imagine, like, I'm thinking of like Monty Python movies where it's dirt floors and you're chained to a wall next to a skeleton. That's the kind of thing.
I never saw those.
Well, it's probably for the best. But, the worst conditions imaginable. But yeah, rather than seeing, oh man, things are going from bad to worse, now I'm in a dungeon. I'm the farthest away from being in a position where the sun and the moon and the stars and my brothers and my mother and father are bowing down to me. Rather than being in an exalted position, I am in the lowest place imaginable.
Yeah. Yeah.
And rather than allowing that shame, the rejection, think about the anger. It's that woman's fault that I'm here, and my brothers, and those slave traders, and so many people to blame and to be angry at. And he was righteous through all of this. I mean, the only sin that we see in Joseph's life, his entire story, is the Bible does hint that he should not have shared the dream with his brothers, or at least it says that his father corrected him. So the only thing that we see in his life that was off was just some immaturity. He was excited about the prophetic word, so
maybe
he goes
some pride.
running his mouth, some pride.
I would imagine there was some pride, yeah.
Sure, yeah. Other than that, though, he's keeping his heart right, and things are going from bad to worse. Yet, in the dungeon, he carried himself in such a way that it says that the manager of the prison didn't have to concern himself with anything because Joseph cared for all of his responsibilities, all of his needs. He took care of everything for this guy.
So I'm just thinking also about the process of forgiveness. I would imagine that was part of his overcoming.
It'd have to be.
The wound. Once again, he experienced another trauma.
Yep.
Right. And he did not allow the narrative of the trauma, the narrative of the wound, to dictate his future. Mm-hmm. So, I would imagine there wasn't a therapist in that prison.
Probably not. No.
Probably.
I think that was just in the last couple of decades they instituted that kind of thing.
So kudos to Joseph.
Yeah.
For doing the work on with God, and himself, But I'm just thinking about that, right? Like,
yeah.
And so, anyways, we can talk more about overcoming, but.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. I mean, it's almost superhuman how you could be in a situation like that and not be angry, not be depressed, not be hopeless. But I do think, I actually write about this in my dream book. I call it, in the section on Dreams of Destiny, I talk about sustaining faith. There's certain prophetic words and dreams, certain things that God speaks to us that imparts faith for our future. And I do think there was something of, they must have been really powerful dreams that he had as a young man, because something was carrying him, not just so that he didn't hang himself, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It wasn't just that something was keeping him from despairing of life and literally, trying to end himself. It was way more than that. Something was sustaining him to the point where he said, I am, again, just like in Potiphar's house, I'm here in the dungeon in the worst possible situation, but I'm going to carry myself like a man who's called to authority and responsibility and leadership. And so he's carrying himself in such a way that out of all the prisoners who are there, it's crazy to think that the manager of the prison chose a prisoner who was there on accusation of rape, that he was going to choose him and say, you know what, I trust you so much and you're such an upstanding young man that I'm going to let you run this whole place for me. Yeah. It's pretty incredible. He must have been really demonstrating major character and trustworthiness. So that's pretty amazing.
Well, and also I think about how sometimes we can fall into this trap of, well, if I can just overcome this trial, then life will be good
that's really
and happy and I don't know, whatever, all of that,
if
right?
I can just get through this.
If I can just get through this.
Breakthrough, things are going to get better. Yeah.
And I don't know. I don't know if that's necessarily wrong to, we don't ever want to lose hope, right? But I think that it can then set us up for great disappointment again when we only expect for things to be what we perceive as happy.
Yeah.
Because clearly, the Bible talks about how there's many trials. Yeah. Many trials. And we see Joseph, not one trauma, two trauma.
Yeah.
one trauma, two trauma.
Three trauma. Going to the dungeon. Yeah, another trauma. Yeah.
But yet, he wasn't in this mindset, or he didn't get in despair or hopelessness, which I feel like is incredible.
Yeah,
so.
Absolutely. Yeah, pretty amazing. And the next thing that we see in his life, you see a couple things happening. One is you see that in the midst of the dungeon, in the midst of this horrible situation that he's in, he's still operating in his gifting, his anointing, and he, again, responds to a pretty devastating situation with a really great spirit. So we know that the cupbearer and the baker were also put in prison with Joseph, and they both had a dream in the same night. And dreams are interesting. Whenever things like that happen, where like maybe you and your spouse have a dream in the same night, pay attention, because there could be something significant. Even if the dreams don't have anything to do with each other, at face value, whenever Pharaoh has two dreams in a row that we're going to see in a little bit, and there was something significant, that meant that God has established the thing and it's surely going to come to pass. So it's just interesting. They both had a dream at the same night, so that was significant, and they're talking about their dreams, and Joseph interprets them. And of course, the baker's interpretation was, you're about to be executed 3 days from now. And then the cupbearer or the butler, his interpretation is, you're about to be raised out of the prison 3 days from now. And it happens exactly like Joseph said, which that's a pretty supernatural dream interpretation. Like, there's no dream book that's going to show you how to pull that interpretation out of that dream. I mean, this was revelatory dream interpretation, and it was right on the money. And so he gets promoted out of the prison, and Joseph says to him, hey, be sure to tell Pharaoh about me. Tell him there's this guy who's got this crazy gift that he predicted exactly what happened, in stunning detail, and nobody could have known this. And so what happens instead is the cupbearer is restored to his position, and it said he completely forgot about Joseph. And so 2 more years in the dungeon, Joseph is there again, slaving away, just running everything for the ruler of the prison. Apparently didn't lose hope, didn't get bitter, didn't get in despair. And then 2 years later, Pharaoh has these 2 dreams. One of them is there's 7 fat cows grazing by the river. Then there's 7 skinny cows who come up beside them, and then they eat the fat cows. Then there's 7 fat heads of wheat, and then 7 shriveled, decrepit heads of wheat that come and devour or consume the 7 fat heads of wheat. And he's troubled, and he's asking all of the wise men and magicians, actually just like Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel's story, and nobody can interpret the dream. And then the cupbearer says, oh yeah, that guy in the dungeon. And he remembered after 2 years. Yeah, exactly. I mean,
bless it.
Yeah, seriously. And so he tells Pharaoh about Joseph. Pharaoh brings Joseph out of the dungeon, and he interprets the dream, which I think is really cool. He gets the symbolism. Cows and wheat are about food supply. I didn't get that for a long time. One day it just hit me like, because I'm trying to understand, like, a lot of the dreams in the Bible, you look at the dream and the interpretation, you're like, yeah, they got that from an angel. They didn't get this from any dream book. So anyway, he interprets the dream, and Pharaoh says of him, is there anyone else in all the land who so evidently has the Spirit of God on him as this man? And he says, there's no one else in Egypt who would be better to execute this plan of preparing 7 years during the time of plenty to be ready for the 7 years of famine.
Wow.
And so Joseph is exalted now, and so he's been faithful all the way. He's been acting like a man who's going to carry authority. He hasn't gotten bitter. He hasn't had a foul spirit. He hasn't gotten in rejection that causes people to want to reject him. As a matter of fact, it seems like he's carrying his heart in such a way that the favor of God is on him, so that no matter where he gets put, whether it's in Potiphar's house as a slave or in the dungeon, there's such favor on him that people are drawn to him, and they're saying like, hey, I want this guy on my team. I'm going to give him responsibility and keep him close to me. And that same favor was on him with Pharaoh, and Pharaoh gives Joseph his signet ring and says, no one in all of Egypt will have as much authority as you except for me. And he says, you're number 2 to me. And Joseph executes the plan exactly like he got in the dream. 7 years he prepares, and he fills all the storehouses across Egypt so that when the 7 years of famine come, he's ready for it, and there's enough food to keep pretty much the whole Egyptian empire alive. You want me to keep going? Or?
Yeah.
All right.
Going.
This part I'm kind of speeding through because we want to kind of talk about the emotional health side of it. But so the next major scene that's relevant to our discussion tonight is one day back in, back home with Jacob and Joseph's other brothers. They're starving a couple years into the famine. They have no food. Yeah. And then Jacob says to his sons, what are you doing just sitting around? We're all going to die of starvation. There is food in Egypt, so go to Egypt and go get us some food. And so they make the long journey to Egypt, and they end up standing in front of Joseph. They don't know who he is. This is 20 years later or something. It's a long time later. Oh, let me say this. This is important. So before his brothers come, Joseph gets married. He's given a princess to marry by Pharaoh, and he has 2 children. It's not Pharaoh's daughter, it's another leader's daughter, but he has 2 children. He names them, their names are in the Bible, I forget which one, they become 2 of the tribes. Anyway, one of them means God has redeemed my sorrow. And then the other one's name means God has made me fruitful in the land of my grief.
Wow.
Yeah, so God has redeemed my sorrow. He's made me fruitful in the land of my grief. I think those names, they show where he's at. They show what's going on in his heart. Yeah. That's his process as he's kind of, coming to the fullness of the prophecy over his life.
Yeah, and I think also, these are keys of him, doing that generational work, right? Creating change. He is choosing to not allow the trauma from his past, the sins of his fathers to once again write the narrative, write his story, write the inner talk about himself and his future and his family. So that's the generational work right there.
And this is something that God absolutely loves to do in our lives. He loves to redeem in the land of our grief, or he loves to make us fruitful in the land of our grief. I think it's whenever we keep our heart right in the midst of really difficult things like that, it's like it opens the doors of heaven for God to be able to say, like, all right, so this person, they're being tested to the core right now. They're walking through something really difficult. And because they're not hardening their heart and getting bitter and opening the door for the enemy to come in and wreak havoc in their life, it's like they're instead opening the door for the King of Glory to come in, and God can begin to bless and redeem and do amazing things. I was thinking about this earlier, but I forgot to mention it to you. I was thinking about many years ago in our lives, we went through a very, very difficult thing at the hands of a leader who, I don't think intentionally meant us harm, but he did do us great harm. We had been promised something by a leader who talked us into moving to another state halfway across the country, and had kind of promised us this, amazing thing where we were going to be, kind of in a dream job scenario with great salaries. Like all of our needs were going to be provided for, and we were going to be doing, what was really in our heart to do in ministry. So we left the ministry we were a part of, which it was time for us to leave there, but it was still, a lot of doors were opening. There was favor, there was fruitfulness. So it cost something to leave there. We move across the country, and then I think a week or 2 weeks before we were going to move to this new city, we spent a few weeks with family in Tennessee and Georgia. And right before we were going to move and start this new opportunity, we get a phone call, not from the leader who had invited us to move halfway across the country, but from his intern who called and said, hey, this person wanted me to call you and let you know that, sorry, but we can't hire you. The position that we talked to you about, we no longer can, bring you on staff. We would love for you to still move here and do the work and do it for free and find your own housing and, do your own thing. We still like you, but that whole thing we promised you that we've been talking to you about for the last year, we can't do any of that.
Yeah.
And it was pretty devastating because we had no plan B.
Yeah. And also we had prophetic words and dreams, that felt like this was.
It seemed like God was also telling us to do this.
That was it, right?
Yeah.
And so, and I think what, hindsight's 2020, but it was really about timing then, right? So, so just to kind of give the other piece of the story, but we had to really keep our hearts right, forgive, not give in to rejection, or not construe the story as a story of rejection, or even at times there was this battle of God, oh my goodness, where is God now in our lives? Because we didn't necessarily feel him in the season. Yeah. Because there was a lot of disappointment. There was a lot of heartache. So
yeah, as a matter of fact, to be very practical, what we did is we started each day by forgiving this person by name and by blessing them and blessing the ministry that they were a part of and just praying, for the blessing of God on them and their family and on this ministry, because we just determined, I think we understood this is one of the most important tests that we'll ever go through. It was very difficult and it was very painful. I mean, we ended up living with your parents for a year because we had no income. We had nothing. We had been chasing God all over the country, following dreams and visions, doing really exactly what we were supposed to do in that season with no kids, but it's not like we had, 10 grand in the bank that we could fall back on. We were like literally putting all of our eggs in this basket. We're going to preach the gospel and we're going to go to the ends of the earth. And here's this opportunity that fell through. And so it's pretty devastating. I actually had days where I thought like, man, I've screwed our lives up. I really, this last 5 years, I should have been like, investing in stocks and, going to school to be an accountant or something because this isn't looking good. And so, we blessed and forgave the person daily. Yeah. And B, because Joseph's kids' names were God has redeemed my grief, and God has blessed me in the land of my sorrow, or something like that. I might be mixing the words up. What ended up happening is we didn't know it, but God was sort of sovereignly keeping us from aligning ourselves with this person. And about 2.5, 3 years later, the things that we had gotten prophetic words about and that we had seen in dreams did actually end up happening pretty much exactly like we had heard and like we had seen. But we had to go through this long, dark night of the soul, this sort of painful wilderness where God did a lot of work in us, taught us a ton of lessons. And I'll tell you, one of the things for me that kept me sane was I went as deep as I could possibly go in the gospel. Like that's what I did for years. Like all of the books I read were the most basic books on the cross and the resurrection of Jesus. And I read, the 4 Gospels over and over. I read the epistles of Paul over and over. I just immersed myself in salvation theology, the theology of the cross. And we would, during that time, we went to pretty much in that area, there's really only Baptist churches, so we just went to all these.
There really was only Baptist churches.
We went to
these, not good Baptist churches.
But some of the services we were in were very dry, and I would sit there singing these 200-year-old hymns, just weeping in the driest church services, having a deep revelation of the gospel. And there's something about I don't know, fellowshipping with him in his suffering, and and choosing to rejoice in the midst of sorrow and loss and disappointment and disillusionment. So it was a very deep work, and I came out of that season with a lot of revelation about the deep things that God does in us. And sometimes the only way he can do something deep in us is something has to touch us deep. That could be deep joy and deep fulfillment, or it can be deep pain and loss and disappointment.
Yeah.
It's all about how we respond in, the deep workings of God. He can redeem anything. God works all things together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And it's not like it felt like that every day, but I think that by the grace of God, a majority of the time we at least had those lenses. This sucks. This is not what we would have chosen, but God's going to redeem. And it was a long process. It was about 3 years before we could actually see the redemptive plan of God beginning to come to fulfillment.
Yeah, and I think that also brings me to a point about the danger of something called spiritual bypassing. And once again, I'm not trying to say we did this all perfectly, because
definitely not.
There was definitely some not great moments. Right?
Yeah, we got in an argument once.
But I wanted to just maybe mention just the danger of spiritual bypassing, which is, first of all, I think it's important when we go through these type of experiences or disappointments, or, really maybe we have some expectations because of a prophetic word or because of a dream or because of whatever. We had this expectation that's going to look this way. That God is going to fulfill it in this way, and then it doesn't look that way, or the timing is not like we thought, right? And so spiritual bypassing, what it does is it's just where we do not allow the acknowledgement of what is happening. We don't allow the emotions to be, seen or felt. I mean, we're not supposed to, live out of our emotions, right? We're not supposed to allow them to necessarily dictate what we do or say or blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. But they are purposeful, and so when we don't allow the acknowledgement or the process of the emotion, we just kind of, I don't know, slap another prophetic word on it, or just say, well, that doesn't matter. We're just going to stand in faith. We don't allow the process of the emotional work, the emotional side of ourself. Then we spiritual bypass it, and that really is unhealthy. Mm-hmm. And so I just want to highlight that, because yes, we stand in faith, and yes, we allow the Lord's narrative to become our narrative, our identity be in him, but we also have to acknowledge the part of ourselves that feels, and that and so I just want to say that.
Things like that are painful for sure. And a lot of the time there's something, I would say all the time, whenever we're going through something difficult, whether it's our fault or whether, it's something that, whether it's something that's been done to us, God always wants to use those things to change our heart. He's always wanting to mature us. He's always wanting to work in us. And so, I think that's good. We don't want to waste our trials. We don't want to waste the things that we go through where we could actually be maturing and growing, rather than just, not letting the Lord do what he wants to do. That's good. All right. So to conclude Joseph's story, the most amazing conclusion to this story is the way that he facilitates the visit of his brothers, and the way that he weaves this plan. It's like 3 chapters where he very intricately weaves this plan so that he gets to meet his younger brother Benjamin and he gets to be reunited with his father. Because if he would have just said, I'm Joseph, your brother, you sold me into slavery, now I want to see my father again, who knows if he ever would have seen his father again.
Or if he would have killed his brothers. I'm sure he could have had that happen.
Oh,
he could
absolutely.
have put them in the dungeon. If he could have repaid them, right, with what they did to him. No way.
Absolutely. Yeah. Even if he was trying to, keep his heart right and, I'm so glad to see you again, bring my father to me, they could have walked out the door and said, okay, Joseph obviously wants to kill us and he wants to, tell our father what we did and he's going to have us thrown in the dungeon. So let's go back and tell our father that we need to move to another country. There's no telling what could have happened.
Yeah.
And so he just plays it so wise. I'm not going to go through the whole story, but you can read it. But he orchestrates this whole thing, and you actually do see his emotions a lot in this story because I think it's 3 times. First, whenever he initially sees his brothers again, he doesn't let them know who he is, and he's keeping this straight face, and he's talking very stern to them. He accused them of being spies. He says, you don't need food. You were sent here to spy out the land and see Egypt's weakness. And they're like, no, we would never do that. And he had to go out of the room and he just starts weeping because of, he's just grief-stricken that he's seen his brothers again. And then there's another time whenever he first sees Benjamin that he has to go out of the room again and he has to start sobbing because he is seeing Benjamin, who is the only other son of his mother, because, there was multiple wives again. And then the third time is right before he reveals himself to his brothers. He weeps so loudly that even the Egyptians, that he makes everybody go out except for his brothers, and he's weeping so loudly that the Egyptians hear him and they run and tell Pharaoh. They're like, I don't know what those guys are doing to Joseph, your boy, but he's in there sobbing. And but he hatches this brilliant plan, and eventually he gets his father to come back to Egypt, and he basically tells him, I will provide for you, I'll protect you, I'll give you the land of Goshen, and he tells his brothers, you can come back and live. But a few things that I want to say, and then we'll comment on them. But one of them is he says to his brothers at the end of this whole elaborate scheme, he says, I'm Joseph, your brother. This is after he kind of weeps and he's hugging each one of them and kissing each one of them. And he says, do not be angry with yourselves for what you did to me. He said, because it was God who used what you did to send me here ahead of you in order to protect you and your little ones.
Yeah.
I mean, what an amazing perspective. He's saying that evil, cruel thing you did where you were going to kill me and you sold me as maybe a teenager as a slave. You can't think of a more horrifyingly cruel thing you could do to someone.
Yeah.
He said it was God who was at work in that to take care of you. R.T. Kendall wrote a book, God Meant It for Good, out of those few verses. I don't think that quote is in there, but it's the gist of it is what you meant for evil, God meant it for good.
Yeah.
And so the perspective that he has there is just so wild. I mean, it's the whole God works all things together for the good of those who love him. But what about that perspective?
I mean, and I'm even thinking about, goodness, just the journey, just the process he was on, and that it probably took that length of time and just those different trials to get him to the place that he could have done that, right? Like, what if the Pharaoh opportunity would have happened right after he would have been sold? I don't know. Would Joseph have been ready to take that position and save his family and ultimately the lineage of Jesus? So, I don't know. I wasn't there, but I'm just thinking about how, the Lord knew and he knows his story and our story and y'all and your story. So, and how everything that you're going through, everything, we're going through, all of us are going through, is part of the story, and God can use it, will use it for good, ultimately.
Yeah, and I don't know if I can make a blanket statement here and say that every time there is rejection, every time there is betrayal, I think I can make the blanket statement to say that God always wants to redeem. He always wants to restore. I mean, you look at Jesus being rejected by his brothers. You see him being betrayed by Judas. I mean, the ultimate act of redemption and restoration and salvation that Jesus accomplished for us, it came through rejection. It came through horrible betrayal and mistreatment and injustice. And I'm not saying that God is in every kind of rejection or betrayal. I definitely don't think that he is, but he absolutely will use it, because those are the things that I think impact us the deepest, whenever, because somebody can't, betrayal's not a thing unless you really care about somebody, Yeah. I mean, maybe it is, but in some sense, like, the only kind of betrayal that really hurts is whenever it's someone you really care about, somebody you really love. And so in the midst of something like that, God wants to do something powerfully, powerfully redemptive. And it may be that the person who betrayed or rejected you, maybe they're not even in the picture anymore. And it's not about, like, maybe they won't respond right to God, and maybe they'll go on being evil and trying to hurt other people. But if we will bring our rejection or betrayal to the Lord, there is a way that we can identify with Jesus and identify with him in his sufferings in the midst of that's almost unique in the human experience. It's like there's an opportunity, I think, to get to know the Lord and the power of his salvation in these kind of things like almost nothing else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also being able to process, once again, I'm going to use self-awareness, being aware of when that hurt, when that wound is trying to, create the narrative, when it's, talking really loudly, when it's overriding the identity of Christ in us. I think that is really important to acknowledge and realize. And when we act out of that, and a lot of the times those things need to be processed. You need find a safe person, a safe place that you can talk with and process, and that they can also give you truth and perspective, counselor, therapy, or a trusted, wise friend, mature friend. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way that God redeems is so extravagant. I mean, we already saw where Joseph gets this beautiful bride and he has these beautiful children. He names them. Basically, God has redeemed my traumatic story. But then whenever Jacob does come to Egypt, the whole family moves to Egypt. So Joseph's going to get to be with them for the rest of his life. And several things happen that I think are so profound. One of them is Pharaoh says to Joseph, hey, I've got the greatest, most beautiful flock in the whole world, his flock of animals. And he says, if any of your brothers or any of your family are shepherds, then let them be the shepherds of my personal flock. And so Joseph's brothers, they were shepherds. That's what they did by trade. Mm-hmm. That's what they were doing out in the field whenever Joseph went to check on them, and they ended up betraying him, as they were shepherds as a family. So Joseph's family became shepherds of Pharaoh's flock. And I do think there's something about, think about the symbolism in that, the authority that we gain. Egypt is a symbol of the world. And so, we can become shepherds of Pharaoh's flock, because of this incredible, almost superhuman response to betrayal and injustice. Joseph sort of opened the door for the people of God to have influence in Pharaoh's kingdom and become the shepherd of his flock. That's sort of a deep thing you could riff on for a long time, but I think it's significant. I think it's symbolic. The other thing is, we know that we're getting very close to the end of Jacob's story and the end of the whole story of the patriarchs. It's coming to the end of the book of Genesis. And one of the things that happens at the end of Genesis is that Jacob blesses all of the 12 tribes of Israel. Like we've got two sons, Asher and Jude, and we've taken the prophecies over Asher and Judah, and we've, kind of customized them for our sons, put them on their wall, because there are these incredible prophecies over each of the 12 tribes. And so kind of the final ministry of Jacob is to bless his sons, and the blessings are recorded there. But 2 times because Joseph brings Jacob and his family to Egypt, and Pharaoh knows about it, and he says, hey, I want to meet your dad. This is Pharaoh, like king of planet Earth, under Jesus, says, hey, I want to meet your dad, Joseph. And so Jacob comes in to meet Pharaoh and blesses Pharaoh. And we already know from Melchizedek and Abraham that the lesser is blessed by the greater. So Pharaoh is acknowledging there's something about Joseph's father that I want this man to lay hands on me and bless me. And then I think it's in the same chapter, it's just a little while later, he does it again. So Jacob ends up blessing Pharaoh 2 times, and then it's in the very next chapter where he blesses all the 12 tribes of Israel. I just think that that's so wild that Pharaoh, who we usually think of as like the oppressor of the people of God, Pharaoh Ramses, who enslaved Israel and had them build the city of Ramses. Well, in this instance, because of the redemptive work of God in Joseph and his heart posture of not allowing bitterness to define him, he had such a noble response that it literally opened the door for the people of God to bless Pharaoh. I'm just thinking about application today, like those of us who carry this kind of noble heart, and I'm not saying us like I'm perfectly walking in this myself, but it's our goal to have the unoffendable heart of Jesus. And anybody who can walk through injustice and betrayal and keep our heart right, I do think that there's like a shift in the heavenly realm so that there is authority to really influence culture and positions of government authority and speak to positions of power to bless Pharaoh, so to speak. And so there's something so powerful. It's literally like we are, suffering with Jesus at his cross and coming out the other side in resurrection. And the people of God end up blessing Pharaoh and becoming shepherd of his flock. Pretty amazing.
All right.
So in conclusion, I would say that this story teaches us that even though betrayal, injustice, rejection, shame even plays a part in the story, even though this can be a part of any one of our lives, God can actually use these things. He can redeem them to do a very deep work in us, and he can use it to affect a whole lot of other people, our family, the generations that come after us.
Yeah, and I think I would say, like, just because something has been done a certain way in someone's generations or bloodline or, past stories, that it doesn't have to continue. And that is hard work, and it's worthy work, and it's God's work, So I would encourage anyone who feels like they need to maybe create some change in their generational line, if they need to kind of clean up the bloodline a little bit to do that. So here we go.
Amen. Yeah, so I'm going to pray, and then we want to share something with you as we get ready to close tonight. But God, we thank you that you are a redeemer by nature. And I just pray for anyone watching tonight or in the future who can relate to this story, maybe who's thinking about ways that they've been betrayed or mistreated, or ways that injustice has been done to them. God, I pray that you would meet each person who's relating to this story, meet them as the Redeemer. I pray that you'd give them a redemptive perspective, God, that you would allow each one of us to see what you desire to do in the midst of pain. God, in the midst of some of the hardest things that we might ever walk through. God, we want to be those that you trust with authority and influence. We want to be those, God, that you can entrust even influence with your people to, because you know that we have allowed you to do a work in our hearts so that we will not betray or we will not act unjustly. And so, God, let your redemptive work be released in each one of our lives. And God, give us grace in the midst of the testing, in the midst of the trial, to keep our heart right, God, to keep our thoughts right, to keep our emotional world right. And God, I just pray for supernatural encouragement tonight in Jesus' name.
Amen.
Amen. Amen. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I want to just remind you again as we get ready to close that if you haven't yet commented and letting us know where you're watching from, please do that. We will go through and read it. If you have questions, if you have comments, you can post them in the chat. Also, if you want to be on our email list, we finally, after months, got our email woes solved.
Praise God.
That was a team effort, and it was quite a job. But now we've got a good email system that's working really well. So you can email us at supernaturaltheology@gmail.com.
Yeah.
We send about 1 email a month, maybe 2. We won't spam you. We won't sell your information. But just email us and say, hey, I want to be added to the list. That's supernaturaltheology@gmail.com.
Yeah.
We do have every Wednesday night a kind of like a podcast, kind of a teaching on supernatural theology. That's Wednesdays at 5:05 on these same channels. We also have a once a month prayer and worship time. It's early mornings once a month. So if you want to know about any of those things coming up, just send us an email. We'll get you the information so that you won't miss anything. So any closing words of wisdom?
That's it.
All right. Bless you all. Thank you so much for joining us.